For many years, Israeli human rights activist and researcher Dror Etkes documented literally every inch of the occupied West Bank and the settlement expansion that happens in the West Bank, and the system of racial apartheid that is being strengthened and entrenched through settlements. We speak in this interview about a recent settler attack that left 4 Palestinians dead, and about what that tells us about the annexationist policies of this current Israeli government, as well as its deep ties to the settler movement. Nullpunkt is a 100% independent interview podcast, and if you want to support us, please do. The link for that support is in the description. It's via Patreon. Thank you so much, and enjoy the interview with Dror. Dror Etkes, you are a researcher, activist, founder of Kerem Navot, which has been following settlement expansions, specifically in the West Bank over the past few years, really meticulously. And we've actually been working together quite a lot on different investigation I was doing. I'm wondering, and over the past few days, we've seen settler attacks really exacerbate and become more extreme, which is a tendency we've seen in the West Bank over the past few years anyways, especially since 2023. But we've seen these attacks now in Palestinian villages like Tel and Kusra. 4 Palestinians got killed, mosques were set on fire. I'm wondering, do you see this as something like a shift, something different, or just kind of more of the same?
I think it's more of the same. This is the right way of putting it, articulating it, looking at it, understanding this phenomenon. This type of extremism, fundamentalism, ultranationalism, if it's not being stopped, if it's not being deterred, it gets always worse.
You spoke about the reactions of extremist ministers in the government, which basically the reaction was to egg this on, right? Netanyahu said they will expand operations in the West Bank in response to these recent attacks. Finance Minister Smotrich said that this area in the West Bank should look like Tulkarem, where we've seen the largest mass displacement campaign basically since 1967. Is this what you were referring to?
When you listen to the way Israeli politicians talk, including senior ministers in this government, they're often using the example of Gaza, what Israel has done in Gaza, total annihilation of huge parts of what used to be the Gaza Strip, as an example of what Israel should do in the West Bank. That's something which you hear quite often in Israeli politics. Tulkarem should look like Rafah as a retaliation, as a punishment. So yeah, this motive is going back, is coming up once and again in the Israeli politics, in Israeli political discourse. And this is another example of how this government is actually encouraging violence and extremism.
I've been researching in the West Bank, doing investigative journalism for more than 15 years at this point, and you've been very meticulously...
Almost as I do. Almost as long as I do.
Well, you know the reality, I think, more routinely, but you've covered, I think, every inch and every centimeter of the West Bank at this point. Often we hear, especially in places like Germany, routine condemnations of settler violence, which, fair enough, I think that's important. But when you're on the ground and you see the way it works, it seems like often these attacks are actually either protected, and if not protected, even actively helped by the Israeli military. I'm wondering, do you think this distinction between settler violence and state violence, is this distinction one we can really still reasonably kind of make?
Yeah, it's becoming much harder to distinguish between these two things. That's true. And after October 7th, the Israeli army had recruited thousands of settlers to regional defense units. Many of them are still in service. And of course, these people have some kind of a double role, On the one hand, they are soldiers and they hold all the authorities which soldiers have. And they use equipment which they get from the military and so on. And on the other hand, of course, they are planted within their own communities. And their communities are very often extremely violent and very criminal. And I would say they also often see themselves as messengers, as people who are actually supposed to carry out the practices, the ideas, policies which their communities support, which means extreme oppression, extreme violence, complete disregard of any legal framework, basically taking as much as possible from Palestinians, pushing Palestinians, shoving them into the smaller enclaves in the West Bank, and then looting, to take, to dispossess, and to loot. This is the dynamic which we see in so many different places. And of course, this is something which could never happen without the assistance of the government and especially the military, especially these units and these people who are in the middle. They are both, they are settlers and soldiers in the same time. And very often when you're in the field, you can see that the settlers are the one who are actually holding the authority. Not because they are the highest ranked soldiers, just because they are the most motivated, they are the best connected, they know the best what they actually want to do. And soldiers, very often, they're afraid from the settlers. They're afraid to oppose the settlers because once you oppose the settlers, that means that you are not a real patriot. It means you might be labeled as a left wing or as a traitor or someone who is not cool with not doing what they were supposed to do, right?
To what extent is this something that comes directly from these ministries? Because Smotrich is himself a settler, right? Is this something that has some guardrails within the military at all?
Militaries, by definition, are violent organs. They're exercising violence. Now, when the military is basically occupying and enforcing some sort of an apartheid regime over 60 years, when this is the main role of this military, this is what the military does. This is what it's expected to do. And you have already third generation, or maybe even more than that, of Israeli soldiers who are serving in an Israeli military, which this is the main mission which this military is carrying out. Now, add to it, of course, the fact that in the last years, the highest commander of the Israeli military in the West Bank is a settler. His number two is a settler. So you have a high-ranked officer, not only these two, also others who are settlers, who are fundamentalist religious, who are extreme right-wing supporters, who are in very centered position of the military. And everybody understands, what is expected. You could see it very clearly, I think, on Friday. The officer was killed by accident. He was actually killed by a settler. And he joined this event when this event was almost actually about to dissolve. When these two settlers arrived and started to attack, all the Palestinians were there. The settlers could go out of a village. But once these two settlers came, which one was killed and the other one was wounded, a new dynamic started, an escalative dynamic started, and you could see how this officer joined these two settlers. And that was, unfortunately, the last mistake he had done in his life.
I'm wondering, this is all happening in the center of the West Bank in Palestine, near Nablus. We've heard a lot in recent months about this annexationist rhetoric that led to the E1 project near Jerusalem. And we've heard a lot about the Jordan Valley. Do you think there's any kind of strategic value to these attacks for the state kind of push for annexation, that these attacks are happening kind of in the center of the West Bank, or is this coincidental just because those guys were extremists?
Attacks are happening everywhere in the West Bank today. There is no safe square meter for Palestinians today in the West Bank. And this is something which had changed in the last years. It used to be true what you're saying, that most of the violence was concentrated in the Nablus area and then Hebron area. The north and the southern part of the West Bank were the wildest and the most violent part of the West Bank. But this is not the case anymore. This is not the case anymore. Today, the violence is so widespread, and it's happening basically wherever there are Palestinians. This is what changed. And the idea behind this violence is very, very clear. They are trying to force the Palestinians into the parts of the villages which are already built up, and basically to keep everything around the built-up areas out of Palestinians. And this, when you look where these outposts are and where the violence is, it's actually directed. And in the last half a year, we see that very significant part of it is actually directed to area A and B. And this is also exactly what happened on Friday. Okay.
Area A and B, meaning areas that are either full under Palestinian authority or partly under Palestinian. And
right, 39% of the West Bank together. The A is 18% and the B is 21%. And areas where the Palestinians were supposed to be able to build and to run their administrative issues independently for 5 years. And of course, Oslo Accord never continued. And here we are 30 years later still with the same categories of the West Bank, ABC. Right?
Hmm.
So you can see that the settlers are directing a lot of the violence, of the provocations, and real land grab into area A and B in order to bring to the collapse of the Oslo Agreement, to bring to the collapse of the PA. And from their point of view, they hope to ignite some kind of a big Palestinian uprising in order to have, from now until the elections, as much as violence as possible. It's clear this is what they need. This is what they're seeking to reach.
So you're saying this surge of violence might also be connected to the fact that they see that Netanyahu's government could fall with the elections, and now they're
I have
trying
no
to
doubt.
sort of use the
I
momentum.
have absolutely no doubt that this
Hmm.
is part of the political strategy
Okay.
of Netanyahu and his partners.
I've visited the West Bank a couple of times since October 23. And when you drive around in a car, as we have done together on research trips, you can't help but notice Israeli flags on every other hilltop. And of course, what that means is
Today
also
they're along the roads as well.
on the
Today
long roads as well.
you cannot drive on a bypass road without driving between flags on both sides of the road. The entire roads.
What that also is indicative of is the expansion of outposts, right? And outposts, just for if anyone isn't familiar with that distinction, are basically settlements that aren't yet formalized or legalized by the Israeli state apparatus. And after last weekend, after these attacks, Netanyahu called for more outposts and for more legalization of existing outposts. What's the end goal here? It's just like full on annexation. What's your read on that?
I think that the end game is to be re-elected. First circle, it's Netanyahu. Netanyahu end game is always Netanyahu. And then everything else, right, left, doesn't matter. It's first of all to remain in power, and right now he has to consolidate his bloc, his coalition, and the way to consolidate his coalition is to incite, is to lie, and to basically preach for violating the law. This is basically what the Israeli prime minister is calling Israeli citizens to do, basically to smash the concept of rule of law and to violate the law. And this is not hilltop youth. This is the prime minister of the state of Israel.
Hmm.
I'm laughing. It's not funny, but this is how it is.
I recently did an investigation together with two other journalists on the wine industry in settlements and how it's also connected to the Israeli wine industry in 1948 as well. Won't go too deep into this. Everyone can read it up in the Frankfurter Rundschau or in 972. I thought about this because you were a source for this and you were super helpful to map out the details of that research. And I just saw that Germany actually blocked the European Union's recent push for banning trade with settlement products. You can still walk in any sort of bigger supermarket in Germany and buy wine from the Golan Heights or wine from Psagot, a winery in the West Bank. What kind of message do you think that sends to Israeli policymakers?
That Israel can get by with everything. That's the message which is being conveyed. That Israel, which is supporting Psagot winery, which is built and developed on land which the owners of this winery had literally looted, stole, robbed from individual Palestinians who live in El Bire. And this winery is being supported also by the Israeli government by different means, receive different public budget in order to encourage their export and their production. If countries like Germany are blocking any attempt to designate this type of merchandise and to say, hey, we don't want in our supermarkets, we don't allow products which are criminal, basically, which are produced based on criminality, on criminal action, on violence. The message which is being sent to the Israeli authorities: go on and do whatever you want. You're not going to pay any price, not domestically and not internationally.
And how important are these things for the Israeli economy? Would it even be that damaging to Israel as a state if Germany or the European Union, for that matter, were to block trade, even if just momentarily, with settlement products? To me, that seems like a no-brainer. It seems like a kind of bare minimum. If you look at the last years and decades developments in Israel Palestine and you look at the way in which the occupation functions, it seems like this is pretty much the first step to any sort of accountability. Would it be such a damaging move?
No, no.
Hmm.
Look, I'm not an economist, so I cannot tell you exactly which percent of Israeli GDP comes from the settlement, but it's not a big part. It's not a big part of what Israel produces. It's not a big part of what Israel sells, exports. I think it's mainly a question of political hegemony. who controls Israel foreign ministry, or who controls Israel foreign policies, who controls Israel altogether, including the relationship which Israel holds with its closest allies, for example, Germany. And the aggressive reaction which you see from the Israeli side, they don't really have to do with the damage which will cause to the Israeli economy. They have to do with the political interests of the politicians who are dealing with this issue to show that they are completely loyal to the settler project and to the criminal aspects. When I say criminals, I'm talking about criminal from the Israeli point of view. I'm not talking about the international laws. I'm talking about the inner domestic Israeli law, which is being violated by this type of settlers. And Israeli politicians are extremely sensitive when it comes to not showing loyalty to the Israeli settlement enterprise, because that might harm their chances to be reelected. They're convinced that they have to show complete loyalty to this project.
And is there any sort of like real opposition to any of this in Israel at the moment? I know that you're kind of a lone wolf in the work that you do. And the joke goes that the Israeli left is essentially a WhatsApp group. But right now, is there some sort of pressure at all?
No, of course not. Also, within the Israeli opposition, there is an overwhelming majority would support the settlers. Perhaps they are not going to support the Israeli terrorism in the West Bank, or the settlers' terrorism in the West Bank. They're going to be a bit more reserved when it comes to supporting this type of actions. But at the end of the day, the majority of the Israeli opposition is supporting Israel's settlement policy, and perhaps there is. It still has to be proven where the Democrats are today. Labor and Meretz together are today merged to a new party, which called the Democrats. They still have to prove that something had been changed there. It was interesting to see, the reactions on Friday, because the most senior members of the party, they both actually condemned the Palestinian terror action immediately and sent their condolences to the family of the victim of the terror action.
Because two Israeli settlers also died.
One settler and one soldier.
And that is, of course, curious because Yair Gulan was one of the leading figures who was kind of seen as like a liberal, left-leaning oppositional figure, potentially.
Right. But he is also an ex-general, and he is also a general who served very big part of his military service was actually in the West Bank as well. And so he is also part of a system. He had been for many, many years part of the oppressive system. And I think that we have good reason to think that part of what he have done remain in what he is today. Yeah. And his reaction, I think, proves that it's part of his DNA, his political DNA, it's part of his identity. He cannot just say things simple as they are. That was not a terror action. Well, it was a terror action. It was a settler's terror action. It was not a Palestinian terror action.
You spoke about how the rule of law within Israel is being corroded. And at the same time, international law is very clear on these questions. The ICJ published its report 2 years ago where it said that not only is Israel's settlement policy illegal, but also the occupation itself is illegal as it is permanent and not temporary. And that Israel, as all serious human rights organizations have argued at this point, is committing the crime of apartheid. What is the international community, in your view, failing to see, or why do they not kind of act more strongly, and what should they do?
I'm not keen on telling the international community what they have to do, simply because it's a bit unrealistic to expect from others to save yourself from your own self-destructiveness. And it's an Israeli issue. Apparently, there are not enough Israelis who are appalled, who are disgusted. If you ask what I think that might be useful in order to bring Israel to realize that there are prices. So obviously it's way beyond banning settlers' merchandise. This is not something which will bring the vast majority of Israelis to the point that they will be convinced that something has to be changed in order to keep their most sacred or important interests. Something else much, much harder in terms of how the world deals with Israel will have to happen. I think that we're still far away from it, although one should say that this government probably had been the most effective advocate for every group who opposes Israel's apartheid regime in the West Bank. I'm sure that there are way, way more people in the world who think that there is a serious problem with this country, with the state of Israel. There's something very, very wrong is going on there. That's mainly thanks to this government.
Just one last question, especially international NGOs have been increasingly under pressure, and there's a big fear given a recent law that was passed in the Knesset that NGOs will be taxed a huge amount of like their income. Exactly. How are you working? Do you face any sort of threats or pressure with Kerem Navot?
Look, until now in Israel, it's mainly a question of the public atmosphere, political atmosphere. So Israeli NGOs are considered to be enemy by many Israelis. We're treated as traitors, as people who support the enemy. Political discourse is very divided and very violent. And it consists also a lot of incitement, not only against Palestinians, but also against Israeli from the left, especially against activists. And not one and not two activists have been attacked in the last years by settlers in the fields. What you really feel here is a change of atmosphere. And this is something which didn't start with this government, something which goes on already for the last at least 10 years, probably even more. I think that a very important milestone in the story is the beginning of the publication of the suspicions against Netanyahu. Once his legal situation had become more and more complicated, he was willing to use more and more extreme rhetoric against Israeli opposition and, of course, against the Israeli NGOs. And that's encourage other Israelis who seek legitimacy from this type of statements. And again, it goes again to the fact that Israeli politics is completely dominated by the far right, completely dominated by settlers. And if you want not to consider to be an Israeli traitor, you have to support Israeli settlement in the West Bank. It became kind of a test. If you don't support Greater Israel, if you don't support the ultimate right of Israel to loot land and to run an apartheid regime in the West Bank, and to oppress 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank. If you don't support Israel's settlement apartheid regime, you are immediately a traitor. This is what happened. This is what happened after 60 years, almost 60 years out of the 70, 80 years that Israel exists. Israel is occupied. And after so many years, after almost 6 decades, very, very few Israelis can imagine another reality. Very few Israelis understand what is the status of a West Bank. Very few Israelis know what the Green Line is. Very few Israelis know what international law means. So this is not only a corruption of the legal system, it's a complete corruption of political culture. It's a complete ignorization of 3 generations in Israel who don't know where the borders of the state of Israel are. And when you don't know it, you cannot imagine it. So everybody who is challenging it automatically and naturally is or an enemy or a rival or a traitor if he's coming from inside.
Well, I think it's incredibly powerful that despite all these attacks and all that pressure, you keep on doing the work you're doing and publishing these reports in Kerem Navot, which people can read up online. So I encourage anyone who listens to this to do that, because that gives you a much more concrete and clear picture of the reality on the ground. And thank you so much for speaking to me.
Thank you for inviting me today.